Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the movie, the Dinesh D'Souza movie, 2000 Mules. Now, I've seen a number of online reviews or analysis, if you like, of the movie, and I'm not really satisfied with any of them. I think they sort of somehow missed the material point of what Mr. D'Souza is getting at. So I just want to sort of add my perspective to this and see where we go. Just before doing that, I want to really define what democracy is, because people think it's just maybe folks who vote every now and again, or that's really only one component of it. So democracy is something that developed and is pretty unique to the Western civilizations, and it's to do with power and decision-making sharing, the sharing of power and decision-making. Now, sometimes it was pretty much the aristocrats, and most of the time it's been that, where, say, a king or a monarch would share power with a group of aristocrats. The power went back and forth. Sometimes the aristocrats sort of held the lion's share of the power. Other times it would be the monarch, and so there was certainly a to and fro there. When it came to forcing the citizens to give up money, then typically that was when parliaments began to appear, certainly in the modern era, and the agreement of at least a section of the populace, or the ones that had the money, was needed before revenue could be raised for things like making war or that sort of stuff, or major public works even. So democracy sort of developed organically over time. Now, there was democracy in ancient Rome, and as we know, in ancient Athens, and from time to time, in varying degrees, other Greek city-states. The Athenians probably had the broader democracy for that time, and the Romans too. They started pretty much an aristocratic thing. The major landowners, people who had to fund and equip armies to fight, they were the ones who had the biggest say, which was considered to be fair enough at the time, and I think would be at any time. But nonetheless, that was so. But democracy's got a number of components. One is the vote, and to how wide the votes. Citizens that are giving up their money and or their life, such as conscripts for the army, for example, should have a say in who governs them. And I think that's fair enough. And if we look at the mass mobilization of World War I, where all the resources of the state, including the population, the economy, were mobilized towards the war, then that meant pretty much the entire population was sacrificing either their lives and or their sons and or in the case of women, being drafted into the workforce and having to work under rather unpleasant conditions. And again, that happened in World War II, where there was this mass mobilization of resources. So the vote was really given to people. Universal franchise was born out of really the world wars. Now, to some extent, you could say that was the case in the United States, where there's universal franchise, but really it wasn't. It was more an elite occupation, certainly in the earlier days. This changed probably around the time of the Civil War, and a more universal view was American Civil War, when a more universal view of the vote was taking place. And of course, again, in the 1920s, and yet again with, say, the Vietnam War, where it was decided that if 18-year-old boys were going to be drafted into the armed forces, that they should have the right to vote as well, which again was fair enough. If you're asking people to lay down their lives, I think it's only reasonable they should have a vote as to who governs them. So the vote was one thing, the extent of the franchise is another. But there were multiple building blocks, for example, the rule of law. Now, let's look at Soviet Russia, which was definitely not a democracy, but people had the right to vote. and were encouraged to do so, but they only had one party and candidate to vote, or more than one candidate, one party, one ideology to vote for. There was no different policies. So they had the right to vote, and you could say the rule of law existed, which indeed it did. There were laws, the rule of law existed, but it wasn't applied universally. If you disagreed ideologically with the government, they could send you to prison for the rest of your life or kill you. If, on the other hand, you murdered someone, you were not a threat to the government, therefore you might get 5 years in prison or something like that. So, and also if you committed crimes in the name of furthering the communist cause, then you would not be punished, or punished minimally. So the law was applied ideologically, not on the basis of the same crime would attract the same penalty to whoever. So rule of law didn't exist in as much as it was politically and ideologically applied and not universally applied. So the other thing was of course due legal process. Now, due legal process didn't exist in the Soviet Union. If you were committed what they believed to be an ideological crime, then your basic rights as a citizen would pretty much evaporate. You could be half beaten to death by the interrogating police. You could be starved to death. You could be left in a cold cell, in winter for days at a time. You could be sent to a prison camp where you were mercilessly tortured by brutal guards who were there to ideologically crush you, and so on. So due legal process didn't apply. The other thing was a freedom of the press. So the press couldn't criticize the government unless it was agreed. For example, there would be certain people in the ruling party that would fall out of favor. They'd piss off the guys at the top. So there would be certain people in the ruling party that would fall out of favor. They'd piss off the guys at the top. So the press would start an attack campaign on that individual, that they'd fucked up somehow, or they'd misapplied the perfect policies of the government, and so on. So you get that, but there was no freedom of the press. The press was politically controlled, 100%. So these are the building blocks of democracy: freedom of the press, freedom of expression, universally applied rule of law, due legal process, and the vote to choose candidates of your choice, to put forward candidates of the people's choice, and then to vote for whichever of those candidates. So in that sense, Soviet Russia, we had the vote, we had rule of law, but they didn't, not in any practical effect. The same goes for communist China even today, the murderous regime of Pol Pot in Cambodia, and in the provinces of Eastern Europe that are under communist control. So there are a number of building blocks to democracy. It's not simply the vote. Now, coming to the 2000 mules, I thought it raised certainly enough serious and deep concerns about the outcome of the election that they should be investigated. Now, I thought that at the time. My position is I don't care who wins. I mean, there are people that I prefer this candidate over that candidate. I still have my personal preference, which is why I have a vote. But I don't care who wins. But I do want the process to be 100% accurate, an absolute 100% expression of the will of the people, the consent of the governed. That is paramount, absolutely paramount. And the price we pay for that, level of probity, is that sometimes people we don't like, or people who have policies we don't agree with, get elected. That's the price we pay for democracy. Sometimes people you don't like get elected. Now, I'm surprised sometimes by, holy shit, that guy got elected. Or I'm surprised in the sense that someone I thought would be useless turns out to be not so bad. Or even the reverse, someone I thought would be quite good turns out to be useless. As a case in point, I thought Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom was an outsider. I thought he would tell the globalists to fuck off, that he would get rid of that he'll solve that Brexit thing, get that finished, that he would stop the illegal immigration and stop all the mass migration, the global. I thought Johnson was an outsider, a maverick, a gadfly, and I thought he would do all that. Therefore, I was deeply upset when he turned out to be more globalist, more pro-globalist, and on his knees sucking globalist cock more than any of the other of the previous prime ministers. He's the most pro-globalist they could have wished. I mean, the globalist wants to be laughing all the way. He's all those voters thinking he was this maverick who's going to fix everything, and all the while he was a globalist flunky stooge. I mean, talk about hoodwinking the people. Jesus Christ. So sometimes we get surprised by people who get elected and what they do and how they behave in office. So, but again, that's the price we pay for democracy. It means that no one gets to decide, but the people get to decide. Now, is that better than having some autocratic bunch of goons who inevitably power will corrupt them and they'll set up the whole scheme to enrich themselves, which is what's happening right now with the globalists. So democracy is something worth saving because it stops despotism. That's what it stops. Like people raved on about Donald Trump's a Hitler and a despot, an autocrat. No, he wasn't. He was subject to the will of the people, and he had to abide by the laws of the Constitution, or laws of the United States and the Constitution, and of course face the voters every 4 years or for 2 terms at least. So this is. When I look at 2,000 Mules, then it raised, in my view, it raised enough questions about the accuracy and probity, certainly the probity of the election, and I think those things are worth forensically examining. Now, there are a whole lot of other issues at the side. For example, the mail-in votes where the name of the voter didn't have to be. The name of the voter was on the envelope, but as soon as you took the vote out of the envelope, there was no, this was called chain of custody. And there were many millions of votes that fell into that category, where they could be where it couldn't be verified as to whether or not it was a real person in a real place and at a real address and that sort of thing. So the latitude for creativity there was substantial. So there are multiple things that had to be looked at. I don't believe that they were examined to the full extent. Those vote recounts were observed. They just recounted the fake votes, or ones that some people alleged were fake. So that was hardly a worthwhile exercise. And then they'd say, "See, we got the same outcome." That was observed. But just looking, if you look at the overall architecture of any election, it doesn't have to be this one, any election. The person with the most coherent message and who campaigns the most vigorously and the most often is 9 times out of 10 the candidate who wins, even the one that campaigns the most often. Even if you assume their policies are roughly equal, the candidate's policies are roughly equal, the one that campaigns the most will tend to win. You can have offsets like the one that advertises the most, for example. So if you get a weak campaigner, but the other, they're spending vast sums of money on advertising and promotion and getting the folks out to do the door knocking, all that sort of stuff, then they can still win. Now, what some people have said is say, well, look, the candidate here had the entire 95% of the media establishment heavily on one side, heavily supporting, promoting. They also had that same media class stopping any negative comment against their candidate. And you couldn't hear anyone that was negative about them online, on social media. Most of those people were kicked off, or their videos were suppressed or shadow banned. So the entire media class were heavily in favour of one candidate. Then you had the machine on the street going around and doing the ballot harvesting and the privatisation of drop boxes, and you had all sorts of other things. A massive machine of street people that were out there signing up voters, helping near dead people to vote, and all that sort of stuff. Now some of it crossed over the line of illegality. Some of it was just simply serious bad form that should have been jumped on. And I noticed that even in states where there was a Republican majority legislature, they just seemed to look the other way and let it go. Things that were clearly of concern, they just didn't seem to bother with. Now, I don't believe that they did that naturally. Any person that represents the people, the voters, would be all over that and would put a stop to it. So you have to question to what extent a lot of these state governments were wholly or partially controlled by the globalists themselves. You only need to get a few people, the Attorney General, the Governor, a couple of other people, and make sure they get nice big waterfront homes for their vacation, and they'll look the other way. Maybe a very, very, very well-paid job for their daughter, and so on. And so it's not expensive to buy. The Australian Parliament, for example, could easily be bought for $700 or $800 million. They could own it for that amount, which is nothing more than loose change for the big financial houses of the world. So it's doable. I mean, whether or not it has happened or is happening or has ever happened, that's another matter. And I'm not saying it has one way or another, but that's how easy it is to do if you really want to do it. A lot of these politicians aren't sort of stoic representatives of the people and particularly morally highbrow or anything. They'd go down like a sack of shit for a few $1 million, and don't doubt that it happens. It does. So my view is that there are many questions, and I think the movie adequately and satisfactorily raised some of those questions, not all of them. There are many other questions, but has satisfactorily raised some questions there that should be forensically examined. And now some people are saying, well, this is an effort to overturn the election. No, I just don't agree with that. I think that's absolute nonsense. If the election was fraudulent, then the people who did it have got away with it. Maybe they'll be held to account one day, but in terms of that election, they've got away with it. Nothing can be done now. But what we can do is make sure it doesn't happen again into the future. Now, the globalists need to control. The globalists have indicated their utter contempt for democracy and the voters. They believe, and this is all over the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, Davos, all this sort of stuff. They believe that a technocratic elite controlled by the financial elite, the big banks, big financial houses, that they should run the world. They should make the decisions and decide what goes and what doesn't go. And you're going to own nothing and be happy and all this sort of thing. They've already decided that. Where they want to return the world's population, or certainly the Western population, to medieval serfdom, and everybody sort of gets a universal basic, approximately everyone gets a universal basic income wage. You all have to consume everything you need to consume. Will have to rent or purchase from the globalists, who will have monopolies, oligopolies, cartels on everything, water, power, shelter, everything will be controlled by globalist monopolies and cartels. So they'll extract their profits and live on their castles in the clouds, while the rest of us will eke out we won't. No one will live. The population will exist. They will be born. They'll exist. They'll die, and that's the future we have to look. Now, for the globalists, elections get in the way. The will of the people, the consent of the government gets in the way. They don't give a fuck about the consent of the government. The government can fuck off. Consent. What those bums? We're the fucking elite here. And we decide. Those bums can just shut the fuck up, and we'll treat them as we wish, however we wish, when we wish. So that's the thing. So elections just get in the way. We know that. So the globalists can get round and pretend we've still got elections by they control the candidates, the political parties, the candidates they put up. They control the narrative, or they control the election, the vote counting. Now, they've got to control two of the three. Now, if they control both the candidates and they control the narrative, that it's the globalist narrative and the policies, then the controlling election doesn't matter, because they're going to get what they want either way. Both candidates are their candidates from the major parties. So every now and again, an accident like Donald Trump will occur, and that freaks the globalists out, and they decide that whoa, we can't have this election bullshit going on. We can't have the people deciding. We fucking decide. We decide who runs the place. We decide the policies. We're not going to have the people making a fucking decision and deciding to elect someone that we can't control. Now, Trump still gave the globalists a lot of what they wanted, but not all of it, and they want all. So it was very clear they wanted to make sure that he didn't get up for another term. So if we look at that overall architecture, we say, well, that's their motivation. How do they do it? They can't control him. They can't buy him. He's a rich man, for goodness sakes. They control the narrative already, but that's not enough. They still think he's going to win. The candidate they've put up is I mean, he doesn't even know what day it is. He's just surrounded by controllers that are globalists selected. He's surrounded by controllers, and he'll do what he's told. He'll read from the teleprompter and say what he's told to say, assuming he even knows what day it is. So they've got him there, but how do they make sure that their candidate gets up? Now, if they leave it to the standard electoral processes, it's a wild card. They don't know who's going to win. It'll still be the people's choice. And they are absolutely adamant that it would not be the people's choice. So when we look at that architecture, the motivation, the outcome the globalists wanted, then it's quite reasonable to assume they would do whatever it took to make sure that their candidate got up and another one didn't. So let's now have a look at was the probity 100% in the election? Well, again, I don't care if whoever won, but I do want it to be a clean, absolutely clean election. And I think every citizen, every politician should direct their energies to that, to make sure that it was a 100% clean election. Now, I think that the questions that Mr. D'Souza has raised are, on balance of probability, suggest it's very likely that those antics of the mules did materially change the outcome of the election, in my view. So given that, those things should be fully investigated, and that electoral laws should be put in place to make sure that these things don't happen again, number one. And number two, the people that orchestrated and engineered these things, assuming it's proven to be so, which would include Republicans and Democrats, by the way, globalists, all of them would be globalist control, then they should do, in my view, they should be doing time in prison. The Justice Department should be chasing them, not chasing parents that are complaining about lesbian studies at their primary school or something. So that's my view about the movie. I think it does very effectively raise those questions, and I think those questions should be investigated. But more importantly, if we don't investigate those questions and we just let, who cares? Then we're in for more of this. Whenever the globalists are threatened, whenever they're threatened, they will attempt to directly alter the outcome or directly prevent the will of the people being expressed. You've been a Tassus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.